Have you ever wondered what really goes on behind the rusted doors of an abandoned hospital? Not ghost stories, not urban legends, but the kind of horror that writes your name before you arrive. From cursed radio signals to forgotten patients who whisper in empty halls, these 10 chilling tales explore what happens when hospitals don't die. They wait. You'll meet lost nurses, time-warped surgeons, and rooms that breathe your nightmares back to life. One door leads to a mirror, another to a funeral. All of them want you. And the worst part? You won't even know you're already inside. Welcome to the dark side of forgotten medicine, the abandoned hospital. You've seen the pictures: broken gurneys, peeling paint, flickering lights in rooms that haven't seen a patient in decades. But what if I told you these places are still alive? In this special collection, we uncover 10 terrifying tales that crawl beneath the skin and nest in the mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Take a walk with Kira Jade, an influencer who live-streamed her final breath in the cursed oxygen room. Follow Logan Wells as he listens to a voice predicting disasters and feels the numbers burn into his skin. Meet Nurse Tanya Ree, whose reflection begged her to trade places in a locked room that shouldn't have existed. And beware of Nick Caro, the man who became the next line on the inventory list after unlocking a door labeled Room Zero Dajus Wetru. These aren't just horror stories. They're warnings. Each hospital was left behind for a reason, but some people go back, and the ones who do, they don't always come out the same, if they come out at all. So before you scroll past, ask yourself this: when was the last time you heard a voice in an empty hallway? Don't miss this journey into madness. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because once you enter, we might not remember you either. Story number 1. It was an old hospital. The kind where the walls creaked and the air smelled stale, like old bandages and forgotten memories. The remnants of its past clung to every corner, the floors darkened with grime that time hadn't erased. The words St. Vincent's Psychiatric Hospital were barely legible on the rusted sign outside, swallowed by years of neglect. But for Mara Lively, it was the perfect place to make her documentary. She had always been drawn to the macabre, to the mysteries that no one could explain. And St. Vincent's had one hell of a mystery to unravel. In 1972, during what had come to be known as Blackout Week, the hospital's patients and staff had vanished without a trace. Not a single person was left behind. No bodies, no clues, no signs of struggle, just the eerie silence of an empty building. The government had swept it under the rug, burying the incident with the kind of cold efficiency that Mara, a documentary filmmaker, couldn't ignore. There was something hauntingly captivating about the case, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Her cameraman, Jonah, was setting up the gear as she stared at the imposing structure. He was more nervous than usual, though he didn't admit it. "You sure about this, Mara?" he asked, his voice rough with uncertainty. "Absolutely," she replied, her eyes fixed on the building's cracked windows, as if she could see the ghosts lurking inside. "We're getting the real story." They'd spent the last few weeks combing through old files, journals, and newspaper clippings, and the more they uncovered, the weirder it got. The hospital had been home to some of the most dangerous and violent offenders, criminals with twisted minds that had been experimented on for years by a doctor named Elias Crow. But after the blackout, it was as if the place had been wiped off the face of the earth. Mara had been skeptical at first. She was a woman of facts, and the supernatural was nothing more than superstition to her. But now, as she stepped into the hospital's decaying lobby, A chill ran down her spine. The silence here was suffocating, as if the building itself was waiting for something, or someone. Jonah was setting up the camera when Mara made her way toward the old reception desk. The thick layer of dust told her no one had been here in decades. Her fingers brushed the yellowed pages of a journal left carelessly on the counter. It was one of Dr. Crow's, and from the looks of it, the man had written furiously. The handwriting was slanted, almost erratic. She opened the journal to the first entry. It is happening again. The patients, they are becoming more aware. They know what I've done. They know what I've made them. I can feel them watching me, even now, as I write. I've lost control. Mara frowned, her skepticism beginning to waver. The words made her uneasy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her. Jonah called out from the hallway, his voice tight. "Mara, you need to see this." She hurried toward him, her heart beginning to race. When she turned the corner, she froze. The camera feed on the monitor was playing a recording from decades ago. Footage of patients walking the halls in slow, almost hypnotic movements. They were staring directly into the lens, their expressions vacant yet knowing. "Who's running this?" Mara whispered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She could have sworn she saw one of the patients. Blink. It was impossible. These tapes had been locked away for years. Jonah was already fumbling with the controls, his hands shaking. "I don't know. It's like someone's messing with the footage." Before Mara could respond, a cold breeze rushed through the hallway and the camera monitor flickered out. Jonah turned to her, his face pale. That wasn't a glitch. The air felt heavier now, and Mara could almost hear the whispers, low guttural voices coming from the walls, as though they were calling her name. Her throat tightened, but she tried to push the fear aside. "We have to keep going," she said, trying to sound confident. But Jonah didn't seem so sure. He glanced nervously at the exit. "Mara, I think something's wrong. Something's not right here." Before she could respond, Jonah's body jerked violently, his eyes wide with terror. Then, without a word, he bolted down the hall, disappearing into the dark corridors. "Mara." A soft voice whispered behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway was empty, but the voice, it wasn't just in her head, it was real. She could hear it clearly now, the soft rustle of footsteps behind her. It wasn't Jonah. She stepped back, stumbling over her own feet, and turned to face the dim light at the far end of the corridor. There, standing in the shadows, was a woman, pale and translucent, her form flickering like an old film reel. "Mara," the woman whispered again, her voice filled with sorrow. Mara's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was hauntingly familiar, though she couldn't place where. She'd seen her before. The nurse's uniform, the thin frame, it all seemed to blur into a memory she couldn't reach. "Who are you?" Mara asked, her voice trembling. The woman stepped closer, her eyes hollow. "I was here when it happened. I saw it all. You need to leave before it's too late, before they take you too." Mara felt the temperature drop. The air was now so cold it stung her skin, but she couldn't move. Her body refused to obey. The woman reached out with a shaking hand, her touch icy and firm. Dr. Crow never stopped. "They never left," the woman whispered, her words hanging in the air like a warning. "They're still here, trapped, watching, waiting." The world seemed to spin around Mara as the walls closed in on her. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The hospital felt alive, breathing, shifting with every step she took. It was as if the building itself had awakened with her presence. She stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but the hallway stretched endlessly in front of her. No matter how far she ran, she couldn't find the exit. The woman's voice came again, softer now, as if from far away. "You're one of them. You're his blood." And then Mara understood. She was Dr. Crow's granddaughter, the product of his twisted experiments. Her entire life had been a lie. Everything that had happened. Here, every tortured soul that had walked these halls was part of her heritage. The patients, no, they weren't gone. They were still trapped, and they had never stopped suffering. The door at the end of the hall creaked open, and Mara found herself facing a small, dark room. It was the last thing she saw before the darkness took her. And then, the camera flickered, back to life. Mara screamed, but no one was left to hear her. The hospital had a new patient, and this time, she was the one being watched. The last patient. Forever. Story number 2. It was Halloween night. The air was crisp and sharp, filled with the scent of decaying leaves and distant fireworks. Ava Martinez stood at the edge of the abandoned St. Peter's Hospital, her heart racing like it wanted to burst from her chest. It was the kind of place kids like her had dared each other to break into for years, but no one ever actually went inside. The stories, the rumors, they were enough to scare anyone off. But Ava wasn't scared. Not anymore. Behind her, Jake stood with his arms crossed, a familiar smirk on his face, though his eyes were filled with concern. "You really want to do this?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "I mean, we could always just, I don't know, grab some candy and call it a night?" She shook her head, the cold wind tugging at her long hair. "No, I have to. She hesitated, the words stuck in her throat, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake already knew. It wasn't just a dare. Ava was running from something, from herself, something she hadn't told anyone about, something she couldn't shake. "All right," Jake said softly, as if understanding her unspoken pain. He glanced at the others, standing a few feet behind them. Rena was the first to speak up, her arms crossed tightly. "This place is just an old hospital, right? Nothing but ghosts and rumors. It's not like there's some hidden dimension waiting for us. You guys are nuts." Benji, the oddball of the group, grinned and cracked a joke. "Well, if there's a ghost in there, I hope it's a friendly one. Maybe I'll finally meet a ghost who gets my humor." Rena rolled her eyes, but Benji didn't seem to mind. He was always the class clown, the one who could make light of any situation, even a situation like this. Ava didn't respond. She was already thinking about the dark halls ahead of her, her heart beating in time with the silent rhythm of the hospital. It wasn't just about Halloween anymore. It was about confronting something deep inside her. Something she had buried for years. The group made their way inside, pushing through the rusted doors that creaked like the bones of some long-dead thing. The smell of mildew and rotting plaster hit them the moment they stepped inside. The hospital was darker than any of them had expected, a place that time had forgotten. They moved through the halls, their flashlights flickering in the heavy, stale air. The walls were peeling, the floors cracked and littered with broken glass and debris. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the soft shuffle of their feet and the occasional chuckle from Benji. "Do you guys hear that?" Rena suddenly asked, her voice tense. The group stopped in their tracks, all of them looking around. There was a faint hum in the air, like a distant machine running without a purpose. Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice low. Ava frowned, unsure of what to say. It wasn't just the hum. It was something else. Something beneath the floorboards. Something watching them. The feeling crept up on her like cold fingers crawling down her back. They came across a door at the end of the hall, hidden behind a pile of old medical equipment. It was marked only with the number 9. There was no label, no name, just the number. And when Ava reached for the door handle, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. "Ward 9? Benji said, chuckling nervously. "What's that supposed to be?" "Never heard of it." Jake frowned. "There's no Ward 9 on the blueprints." "We checked." Ava didn't answer. She just turned the handle. The door swung open with a groan, revealing nothing but darkness. The air inside felt thick, as though it was pressing against them, pulling them in. Before anyone could say anything else, Ava stepped forward. The others followed her, hesitantly at first, then all at once. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the last of the light from the hallway. The room, or whatever this place was impossible to describe. It was like nothing they had seen before. It wasn't just a part of the hospital. It was its own world, its own dimension. The walls seemed to stretch and bend in ways that didn't make sense. The floor was uneven, as though they were walking on something that didn't belong. Then came the whispers, a soft voice, barely a murmur, tugging at the edges of their minds. Ava turned quickly, trying to place it, but no one was there. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others nodded, but there was a strange hesitation in their eyes. They didn't seem to know where the voice had come from, but it was real. So real. And then they saw it. At the far end of the room was a figure. Tall, almost too tall, with a thin, white face staring at them. The figure didn't move. It just watched. It was wearing a long, tattered coat. Its eyes were empty, hollow. Ava stepped forward, but something held her back. The ground beneath her feet began to pulse, like it had a heartbeat of its own. "This isn't right," Rena said, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." Ava turned to her, but when she looked back, Rena was gone. There was only silence. "No," Jake muttered, his face turning pale. "No, no, no." Ava's heart raced. She spun around, trying to see where Rena had gone. The walls seemed to close in, shifting around them. But there was no trace of Rena, only the whispering. Benji started to laugh. At first it was a nervous chuckle, then it became frantic. His eyes darted around, unseeing. This is hilarious, right? You're all pranking me? You have to be." But Benji wasn't laughing for long. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. They weren't words anymore. They were feelings, thoughts, fears. Ava felt her own guilt surge within her, memories she had buried long ago clawing their way to the surface. "Stop!" she shouted, but it did nothing. The whispers were becoming more intense. They were feeding off her fear, feeding off all of them. And that was when she realized it wasn't just a haunted hospital. It was something much worse, something alive. Dr. Venler, she realized. The doctor who had created this pocket universe. A madman who had twisted his own soul into something monstrous, feeding off the pain and trauma of others to escape death. Ava's vision blurred. She could hear Jake calling her name, but it felt distant. Benji was gone, his laughter replaced by sobs. Then everything went black. When Ava woke up, she was alone. The air was still thick, but there was no sound, no whispering, no movement. Just the silence of a place that had consumed everything. She was the only one left, but she wasn't the same. Her hair had turned white, her eyes empty, like a lifeless shell. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The silence inside her was too much. As she stumbled out of the room, she saw the door to Ward 9 behind her, closing slowly, almost as if it had never been opened in the first place. And Ava was trapped. Trapped. In that place where time had no meaning, where fear had a life of its own. But she had escaped, just like Dr. Venlor. But now, there was no escape from the silence. Story number 3. Dr. Lara Kim had never felt more out of place in her life. Fresh out of med school, she was now an intern at St. Hilda's Hospital, a crumbling institution on the edge of town that still held an air of faded grandeur. It was the kind of hospital where time seemed to stand still, and the walls, like its patients, had grown old and worn down. Lara was used to being nervous, new to the world of medicine, desperate to prove herself, and constantly battling the imposter syndrome that clawed at her every time she stepped into the operating room. But nothing could have prepared her for the discovery she was about to make. It happened late one night when she was assigned to clean out an old storage room in the basement, a place filled with outdated medical supplies and forgotten files. The room had a strange smell, moldy, like damp books and rotten wood. As Lara moved a stack of old crates, a loose piece of drywall caught her eye. Curious, she pried at it, and to her surprise, the wall gave way with a soft creak. Behind it was a small alcove, and within the alcove, a leather-bound journal lay nestled among a pile of dust. It was old. The edges of the pages were yellowed and frayed. The cover was cracked, and on the inside, written in a careful hand, were the words, Dr. Vexholm's surgical notes. Lara felt an odd thrill run through her. She'd heard the name before. Dr. Vexholm was one of the hospital's founding surgeons, a genius, they said. But his career ended abruptly in the early 1940s after rumors of unethical experiments. Some claimed he had been driven mad by his work. But this journal was something else entirely. She tucked it under her arm, intending to read it later when she could get some peace. But peace was the last thing she would find. The first night, she only skimmed through the journal. The notes were disturbing, but at first she dismissed them as the ramblings of a man long gone. Dr. Vexholm wrote about his theories, about medical evolution, and how surgery was a tool to transcend the limits of the human body. He described horrific experiments, mutilations done in the name of progress. He spoke about recreating the human form, pushing the boundaries of life and death. Lara felt a strange unease, but she pushed through. After all, she was a doctor, and she was here to learn. This was the past, a history of medical experimentation. Horrible but necessary for the evolution of the field, right? But then the dreams began. It was the first time Lara woke up in cold sweat, her sheets tangled around her body, her heart racing. She had been in an operating room, but it wasn't any operating room she recognized. The lights above her flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. She was wearing scrubs, gloves stained in something dark red. Her hands were covered in blood, and on the table in front of her, a body. It was not human, not fully. The skin was stretched in unnatural ways, and there were cuts. So many cuts. The face was swollen, distorted, and the eyes, those empty, lifeless eyes, stared right at her. She jerked awake, gasping for air, her skin clammy. Her apartment was still dark. She could hear the distant hum of the city outside, the usual quiet of a late night. But something felt off. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and she couldn't shake the image of that grotesque, mutilated body. The days blurred together. After that, the more Lara read Dr. Vexholm's notes, the more she felt herself pulled into his world. The procedures he described seemed so real, so precise, as if she could feel each scalpel's cut, each stitch he placed. She'd wake up from her dreams, sweaty and trembling. But somehow, the images stayed with her, like a film running in the back of her mind. She began noticing changes in herself. Her hands would twitch like they were itching to perform surgery, even when she wasn't in the operating room. Her thoughts became fragmented. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten or slept properly. When she walked past the hospital's operating theater, she felt a pull, an urge to enter, to work. It wasn't long before David, another intern, noticed the shift. He had been Lara's closest friend at the hospital, a calm, steady presence who always seemed to know when something was wrong. He had seen her become distant, distracted. He had seen the tiredness in her eyes. "Lara," he said one evening as they scrubbed in together, "you're not okay. You haven't been yourself lately. Have you been reading that journal?" Lara froze, the surgical instruments in her hands feeling heavier than they ever had before. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound casual. David shook his head, his brow furrowed. "You're acting strange. Like you're not here. Like something's taken over. And don't tell me it's nothing. I can see it. We all can." She felt a pang of guilt, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "I'm fine, David. Just tired, you know? It's a tough rotation." But David wasn't convinced. He narrowed his eyes. "The janitor, Ms. Geller, she said something to me today. She said, 'Stay away from the surgeon.' She said, 'If you read his notes, you'll never be the same again.'" Lara laughed it off, but inside, a sickening feeling curled in her stomach. The surgeon, Dr. Vexholm. The next time Lara found herself in the operating room, it felt different. She didn't remember walking there, didn't remember the time passing, but here she was, standing over a body, scalpel in hand, the familiar weight of the blade comforting. But there was something wrong. She wasn't supposed to be performing surgery today. She wasn't even on the schedule. The body on the table was a mannequin, or so she thought. The skin was too pale, the veins too dark, the face too dead. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The journal's words echoed in her mind. "Perfection is achieved only through pain." The room spun. The scalpel felt heavy in her hands, but she couldn't stop. She needed to finish. Her hands moved as if they had a mind of their own, slicing through flesh and muscle, stitching up wounds with an eerie precision. She didn't know if she was sleepwalking or if she was awake at all. She woke up later in her apartment, blood on her hands. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, but there was something more, the thick, metallic stench of blood. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat. She was wearing scrubs, soaked in blood, her gloves slick with it. And then the memory came rushing back. She had been in the operating room. She had performed surgery. But the patient, the body, there had been no patient. There was no record, no surgery scheduled. She was alone. No one would believe her. No one could know. The journal was cursed, and she had become its vessel. Dr. Vexholm's spirit was alive in her, and there was no escaping it now. Lara stood by the window staring out at the city, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The feeling of the scalpel in her hand lingered, the pull to operate still there, just beneath the surface. And somewhere in the darkness she could hear a voice whispering, "You will never escape me." She wasn't sure who she was anymore, and she was afraid she might never know. Story number 4. Miles Greer never thought he'd be back here. Not after what happened, not after he lost everything, but his brother, Brian, had gone missing, disappeared without a trace, and Miles couldn't let go. Not this time. He had to find out what happened. It was late when he pulled up to St. Andrew's Hospital, an imposing building tucked away on the outskirts of town. The lights flickered in the windows, casting strange shadows across the front. Miles's boots thudded against the cracked pavement as he made his way to the entrance. He'd been here once before, years ago when he worked as a paramedic. The place had a reputation, a dark one, but he didn't care about that now. He only cared about finding Brian. The front doors were locked when he tried to open them, but just as he was about to turn away, a voice came from behind him. "You looking for someone?" Miles spun around. It was a nurse, standing under the dim light, her face partly obscured by her white cap. Nurse Ray, she said her name was. She had a strange air about her. Too calm, too still, as though she wasn't entirely there. "Here for my brother," Miles said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He was admitted last week. Brian Greer. He's gone missing. I need to find him." Nurse Ray smiled, but there was something off about it. Something that made Miles's skin crawl. "We've been having some complications with the patients recently. I'm afraid you're too late for visiting hours." "What do you mean?" Miles asked, his frustration rising. "I need to see him. Now." "I'm afraid," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "There's a rule here. No one enters or leaves after midnight, and it's almost that time." Miles glanced up at the clock tower, the one on the roof of the hospital. It was just minutes to midnight. He didn't care. He needed to see Brian. "Please," Miles said, stepping closer. "I just need to see him. You don't understand. I can't leave without him." Nurse Ray's expression softened, but only for a moment. "All right, but only until midnight. The rule is the rule." Miles didn't care about rules anymore. He followed her down the long, dim hallways, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The hospital felt colder than it should have, and the lights seemed to flicker at odd intervals, like the place was alive, breathing in and out. They arrived at a locked door marked Unit 4. Nurse Ray paused for a moment, then unlocked it with a key. "Go on," she said, her voice low. "But remember, once the clock strikes 12, you won't be able to leave." Miles nodded, his heart pounding. He stepped into the room. Inside, everything was eerily quiet. The beds were empty, save for a few stray sheets and forgotten medical equipment. He spotted Brian's name on one of the charts, but when he turned around, his heart stopped. Standing there at the far end of the room was Brian. But it wasn't right. His brother looked different. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, like he'd aged years in the few days since Miles had last seen him. "Brian!" Miles called, his voice trembling. "Is it really you?" Brian didn't respond. He just stood there, staring, his body swaying slightly as if in a daze. "Brian!" Miles shouted, rushing toward him, but when he reached out to grab his shoulder, the figure vanished. Miles stumbled back, eyes wide, looking around the room in confusion. He swore he had seen him. But now, there was nothing. The clock on the wall struck 12. The room shifted. The walls warped. Miles felt a sharp pain in his head, as if time itself was ripping apart. And then he heard it. His brother's voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Miles, I'm here. I'm always here. Suddenly, there were 2 Brians, then 3, then 4, each one standing in different corners of the room, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted with pain. They spoke in unison, their voices overlapping. I didn't want to come here. I didn't want to stay. But now I'm trapped. Like you. We're all trapped. Miles backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What was happening? What was this place? Was it a nightmare? Was it real? He stumbled out of the room, disoriented. The hallway was different now. The walls seemed to stretch and twist in ways they hadn't before. Time wasn't right here. It felt like he was caught in a loop. Everything repeating, but with small, horrible changes each time. Nurse Ray appeared again, this time standing at the far end of the hall, watching him. You should have left before. Midnight, she said, her voice cold and mechanical. You should have listened. Miles turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch forever. No matter how fast he ran, the end of the corridor stayed just out of reach. He could hear Brian's voice echoing through the halls, growing louder, more frantic. Miles, please, you have to help me. You have to help us. But then the clock started to tick backward, and everything reset. When Miles woke up, it was in the same room, the same sterile smell, the same hospital. But this time, it was different. He wasn't alone. There, standing next to his bed, was Brian again. But this time, Brian didn't look sick. He looked fine, healthy, alive, like the last few days hadn't happened at all. Miles, Brian said, his voice calm, almost too calm. I've been waiting for you. Confused, Miles sat up. What? No. You were missing. What happened? Where are we? Brian just smiled, his eyes glinting with something that made Miles's blood run cold. You're here with me now, Miles. And so is everyone else. We're all part of this cycle, this hospital, this place. Miles' heart dropped. This wasn't right. This couldn't be right. Brian, you don't... But before he could finish, the clock struck midnight once more. And everything changed again. Over the next few nights, Miles learned the truth. The hospital, locked away from the outside world, was caught in an endless loop. Each night the clock reset, and with each reset the horrors grew. The people in the hospital weren't real, not anymore. They were echoes, fragments of other timelines, other versions of the people who had walked the halls before. And each time the clock struck midnight, the cycle started anew. He tried everything to break out, tried to fight against the loop, but it was no use. The night warden, a masked entity, appeared each time the clock ticked, resetting everything to its starting point. I'm the keeper of time here, the warden said, its voice cold and hollow. And once you're part of the loop, you'll never leave. But Miles didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to find a way to break it. Finally, one night, after what felt like an eternity, Miles found the courage to confront the night warden. He fought through the twisted corridors knowing the clock was about to strike midnight. He couldn't let it reset again. He couldn't let it happen. With a scream, he lunged at the warden, pushing against its cold, masked face. But as the clock struck 12, He felt everything break apart, his body, his mind, his very soul. And when the reset came, he was gone. The next day, Nurse Ray found another visitor, standing at the hospital's front doors, looking lost and desperate. "Looking for someone?" she asked with a knowing smile. The visitor nodded. "I'm looking for my brother, Miles Greer. Have you seen him?" Nurse Ray tilted her head, a flicker of something dark crossing her eyes. "Ah, yes, we have him. He's somewhere inside." And then the clock struck midnight again. Story number 5. Natalie and Eric had always dreamed of a home in the country, a fresh start far from the city's chaos. The sprawling land they bought was perfect. Rolling hills, tall oak trees, and an old farmhouse at the center, waiting to be restored to its former glory. The price was a steal. It was a dream come true. And then came the baby. Natalie was overjoyed when she found out she was pregnant, but it wasn't long before she started to feel something else. A strange pull, a deep unease that wouldn't leave her, not even at night. It wasn't the pregnancy hormones, not exactly. It was something in the house, something she couldn't shake. At first, it was just the wind. She told herself it was just the wind, blowing through the cracks in the old walls. But then, at night, she began hearing other sounds. Faint cries, soft lullabies sung in a voice that wasn't her own. Sometimes, the sound of a baby's rattle would rattle in the distance, as though it had been left alone in an empty crib, forgotten. Eric tried to calm her, assuring her that it was just the house settling. But it wasn't. It felt wrong, like something, or someone, was watching them. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the house creaked with its usual noises, Natalie couldn't take it anymore. She pulled Eric aside, her hand on her stomach, her face pale with worry. "Eric, there's something wrong here. I hear it every night. Babies crying, lullabies playing. We need to find out what happened." Eric hesitated, then nodded. He had seen how much the house was getting to her. He had his doubts about the supernatural, but he loved her. If it meant digging into the property's past, he would do it. The next morning, they visited the county records office. What they found sent a chill through their bones. The land, they learned, wasn't just an empty plot waiting for a new home. It had once been the site of a maternity hospital, a facility that had closed down decades ago after a tragic fire in the 1930s. The fire had started late one night, catching the building off guard while it housed dozens of newborns in the nursery. Only a few staff members managed to escape, but the babies, trapped in their cribs, didn't make it out. The fire had ravaged the building completely, leaving nothing but ash and memories. But there had been whispers, rumors of missing infants, babies who were never found, whose bodies were never recovered. The land was abandoned after that, and eventually it was sold off in pieces. But the nursery, the records showed, had never been fully cleared away. The hospital's remnants remained hidden beneath the foundation of the new house. Eric and Natalie drove back to the property, the news hanging heavily between them. The house, beautiful in its dilapidation, suddenly felt suffocating. Natalie could barely breathe as they walked through the front door. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying with it the faintest echo of a lullaby. That night, as the cries started again, soft at first, then growing louder, Eric couldn't deny it any longer. Something was here. Something from the past. And it was angry. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and increasing unease. Natalie's pregnancy progressed, but so did the disturbances. The cries were no longer just whispers in the dark. They were loud, urgent, desperate. She started to feel the pull of something unseen, as though it was reaching for her, calling to her. Her dreams were full of visions of infants reaching for her, their tiny hands grasping at her like they were drowning. It was on one of these nights, when the cries were the loudest they'd ever been, that Natalie woke in a cold sweat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. She heard the sound again, the rattle, then the lullaby. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, her hand instinctively going to her stomach, and then she saw it. Above her, in the attic doorway, a faint glow. She could make out the shape of an old crib, an old nursery, its furnishings still perfectly preserved, as though frozen in time. The rocking chair moved slowly, back and forth, as if someone were sitting in it, gently rocking a baby. The shadows in the room shifted, and for a moment she thought she saw the figure of a nurse standing near the crib, humming a lullaby in a voice that wasn't quite human. It was Matron Halloway. Natalie and Eric didn't wait long before calling in Dean, a local paranormal investigator who had worked on cases like this before. Dean had heard of the hospital's tragic past, and he was familiar with the rumors of restless spirits that had been circulating in the town for years. He agreed to come over, bringing his equipment with him. The night Dean arrived, the air in the house was thick with tension. Natalie could barely speak, her nerves frayed, her heart racing. Eric's skepticism was starting to crack, and Dean's calm, confident demeanor did little to ease the growing sense of dread. As they set up cameras and EVP recorders, Dean explained what he believed was happening. The fire wasn't just an accident, he said, his voice low. It was a tragedy, yes, but sometimes, when a place holds so much grief, so much suffering, the spirits of those who died can't move on. They get stuck. The nursery, that's the epicenter. And now, it's pulling on your baby. It wants him. Natalie felt the blood drain from her face. You mean, it's after my baby? Dean nodded. It wants to take him. The souls of those babies. They're trapped here, and Matron Halloway, she's still taking care of them, even in death. She's trying to keep them close. And you're in the way. That night, as midnight neared, the cries grew louder. The rattle shook with a terrifying urgency. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off the sorrow of the souls trapped inside. Dean set up his equipment in the attic, and Natalie and Eric followed him, both of them shaking. The air was thick and cold, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The nursery was just as it had been described. Old cribs lined the walls, their paint chipped and faded. The rocking chair moved back and forth, though there was no one sitting in it. And then they heard it, the soft, gentle hum of Matron Halloway singing a lullaby. But there was something wrong with it, something terrifying. The lullaby wasn't a comforting sound. It was distorted, like a nightmare repeating over and over. Suddenly, Natalie's water broke, a sharp pain cutting through her. She gasped, clutching her stomach, but before she could speak, the shadows in the room shifted. The nurse appeared, Matron Halloway, her face pale and twisted with a grim smile. She held a baby in her arms, but it wasn't a baby at all. It was a doll, its eyes wide open and lifeless. "You will not leave," Matron Halloway said, her voice a chilling rasp. "The nursery needs to be filled. The babies need their mothers." The temperature dropped and the cries grew deafening. The room began to spin, the cribs shaking violently as if the spirits were trying to break free. The walls seemed to close in, and Natalie's heart raced with terror. In that moment, Dean acted. Quickly, he grabbed a canister of holy water and threw it at the spirit, chanting an incantation. Matron Halloway screamed in fury, her form flickering and distorting. The cries of the babies grew into an awful, soul-wrenching wail, and the entire room seemed to collapse in on itself. The house burned to the ground the next morning. Eric and Natalie were rescued, but they were hollowed out, broken from the terror they had endured, and though the flames had consumed everything, burning the nursery and the ghosts of the babies who had once filled it, the cries never stopped. They still echo in the ashes, haunting the land, waiting for the next soul to come too close. Eric and Natalie moved far away, but at night, even in their new home, they would hear it. The faint lullaby, the soft cries of babies drifting through the walls. And Natalie knew the truth. Some echoes can never be silenced. Story number 6. Kira Jade had made a name for herself as a ghost hunting influencer. Her face glowing under the constant stream of camera lights, her followers growing by the day. She didn't just explore haunted places, she lived for the thrill, for the scares, for the views. People loved her, loved watching her walk into the darkest corners of abandoned hospitals, old asylums, decaying prisons. The kind of places that gave you chills just thinking about them. But Kira had a secret. She was terrified of suffocating, of losing breath, of feeling the air around her thin out until she couldn't fill her lungs. It was a fear she'd kept hidden behind her confident smile, her sharp, adventurous persona. It wasn't something she ever told her followers. Who would follow a girl who was afraid of something as simple as air? Tonight, Kira stood in the heart of an old abandoned hospital, her phone in hand, streaming live as she pushed open the door to the oxygen therapy room, a place notorious for its eerie history. The room was old, decaying. The once sterile walls were now yellowed, the machinery rusted and abandoned. The oxygen tanks lined the corners like forgotten sentinels, their gauges frozen in time. "All right, guys," Kira said into the camera, her voice confident. "Tonight, we're in the oxygen room, a place that's said to have claimed many lives. People used to come here for treatment, but something went wrong. The therapy, it wasn't just for the sick, but for something much darker." She glanced around, her breath catching for a moment as she took in the suffocating stillness of the room. The air felt too thick, like it wasn't quite right. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to push past the discomfort. This was for the fans. This was for the views. The live stream chat exploded with comments as her viewers joined in. She read a few out loud to keep the momentum going. "Do you feel the chills?" one person asked. "Isn't this place the one where people saw shadows?" another wrote. Kira smiled and waved her hand. "I'm not afraid of shadows, guys. Let's see if we can find something a little more real tonight, huh?" As she continued speaking, Leo, her tech guy, adjusted the camera behind her, ensuring the angle was perfect. Mira, her fellow influencer and occasional partner in these ghost hunting expeditions, stood a few feet away, egging her on. "Come on, Kira," Mira grinned. "You're gonna stay longer than the usual 10 minutes, right? Don't let me down." Kira nodded, smiling through the unease that was slowly creeping up her spine. She had to be brave. She had to keep her followers entertained. The oxygen tanks in the corners looked wrong. Too many of them, too close together. The room seemed too big and too small all at once, like it was breathing, expanding, contracting, with every step she took. But then, as the camera recorded, something strange happened. At first, Kira didn't notice, but viewers in the livestream chat did. "Holy shit, Kira, what's behind you?" One viewer typed, sending a barrage of concerned emojis. Another comment flashed on screen. "Dude, did you see that? A face in the window." Kira turned to look behind her, her heart skipping. There was nothing there. Nothing at all. But when she turned back to the camera, she felt the air shift. Something was different. She felt heavier, like the room was pressing in on her. She couldn't breathe properly. Okay, guys, I'm gonna keep going," she said, trying to shake it off. "Nothing back there, but we're here to find out what's going on in this room, right? Let's see what we can uncover." As she continued walking deeper into the room, a cold draft ran across her skin, and that's when she saw it. At first, it was subtle. A figure, barely visible, standing in the far corner of the room, just outside the frame of her camera. It was tall, gaunt, almost skeletal. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its breath, she could hear it. Slow, labored, like someone gasping for air. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. It was only when she turned her back to the camera that things started to get even weirder. The livestream chat exploded. "What the hell?" one person wrote. "Is it the air in there? Kira, are you okay?" Another comment popped up. "Look at the reflection in the glass," someone typed. Kira glanced at the screen, her stomach sinking. The reflection in the window behind her wasn't hers. It was something else. A figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile stared back at her. But when she turned to face the window, the figure was gone. "Guys, you're seeing things. It's just the lighting," Kira laughed, trying to sound calm, but her voice was shaky. Her pulse was racing. Then, just as she was about to move toward the corner, the condensation on the wall started to form letters. Slowly, as if someone was drawing them with invisible fingers, the words, "Help me," appeared. Kira stared at the wall, her breath hitching. Was this part of the ghost hunt? Was this some kind of prank? But no. There was something about the way the letters formed that made her skin crawl. She turned toward the camera, trying to keep it together. All right, guys. This is getting a little freaky, right? But we're gonna stay calm." She took a step forward, but something strange happened. The air thickened again, and her vision blurred. She couldn't focus, and then she heard it. The breathing, that deep, rasping sound, growing louder. The figure in the reflection, it was real. It was standing behind her now. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was closing in on her. "Leo. Leo, I think we need to cut the feed," Kira whispered into the microphone, her voice cracking. "Something's wrong. This feels wrong." But when she glanced back at the screen, it wasn't just the figure in the reflection she saw. She saw herself, but she wasn't just standing there, recording. In the replay of the footage, Kira was doing horrifying things. Her hands twisting, her body jerking, her mouth moving as though it was speaking in a language she didn't understand. She was suffocating, gasping for breath, her face contorted, in agony. It was as though the air in the room had taken hold of her, filling her lungs with something other, something ancient, something hungry. And then her followers started dying. One by one, messages poured in. The fans who had watched her live stream, who had been captivated by her fearless antics, were gone. Their deaths weren't just accidents. They were tragic, mysterious. Heart attacks, drownings. The same cause of death, suffocation. Kira's mind raced, her hand shaking as she held her phone. Was this part of the curse? Was this all because of the oxygen room? She had to leave. She had to end the broadcast. But the air was thick again, the breaths coming faster, more frantic. And then, just before the feed was cut, Kira felt herself being pulled back into the room, her body jerking against her will. Days passed. Weeks. Kira never left. She never stopped live streaming. Her eyes were glazed, her voice barely a whisper, her lips constantly forming the words, "Help me." And her followers, they'd grown. They'd multiplied, but they were also trapped. Trapped in the same suffocating fate. Kira Jade became a legend. A viral sensation, forever streaming her last moments. Her eyes hollow, her breath ragged. The whispers of "help me" echoing in the background. Her feed never stopped. Story number 7. Theo didn't know how long he'd been walking. It could have been days. It could have been weeks. He had no sense of time, not anymore. His boots, worn and cracked, barely made a sound as he trudged down the empty, cracked road. The air smelled like damp earth and something faintly sour, like the decay of old memories. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed shelter. Then, through the trees, he saw it. The lights were on. The building was tall, made of red brick but worn by time. It looked like it had been there forever. A hospital. He didn't think twice. His legs carried him forward as if they knew the way, like something was pulling him toward it. The hospital's lights glowed warmly, promising warmth, safety, even if it seemed odd for a place like this to be so well lit at this hour. When he pushed through the heavy glass doors, a rush of cool, sterile air hit him, and he stepped into the lobby. The floors were polished, the walls a soft cream, and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights hummed above. The place felt clean, almost too clean. A nurse, her hair pulled tightly into a bun, glanced up from the desk but didn't acknowledge him. She went back to scribbling something on a clipboard, her eyes darting between the paper and her thoughts. Theo stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough from travel. She didn't look up. He cleared his throat. "I need a room. Somewhere to stay for the night." She didn't respond. It was strange. The nurses, the orderlies, even the patients moved around him without saying a word. He tried again, walking deeper into the hospital's labyrinth of hallways. Each floor looked the same, sterile and unchanging. There were patients here too, shuffling in hospital gowns, but none of them seemed to notice him. They walked aimlessly, some muttering to themselves, others staring blankly at the walls. But no one spoke to him. No one asked if he was lost. Theo's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten in how long? But there was no sign of a cafeteria, no smell of food wafting through the halls. His thoughts were foggy, his steps uncertain, but he pressed on. He found a lounge area and sat in one of the chairs, wondering if he was dreaming. The patients wandered in and out, staring past him as if he didn't exist. He reached for a book lying on the table, but just as his fingers brushed the cover, someone spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Theo whipped around, startled. An elderly woman sat in a chair opposite him. Her face was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She wore a faded hospital gown and her eyes were sharp, despite the wrinkles that covered her face. "What do you mean?" Theo asked, trying to make sense of the strange feeling gnawing at his chest. "You don't belong here," she said again, her voice quiet but firm. "You're like the others. Forgotten." Theo frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean, forgotten. The old woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. This place, it's for people who are lost. You're not the first. You'll never be the last. No one remembers you here, Theo. Not the way you think they do. He recoiled, standing up. What are you talking about? I just need a place to stay, a place to rest. She shook her head slowly. You don't understand. You're dead, child. And so are we. We're all stuck here, trapped in this hospital for the forgotten. Theo took a step back. The air felt suddenly thick. No, that can't be. I'm not dead. I'm just... He stopped. He didn't know what he was just. He had nowhere to go, no purpose. But dead? The old woman smiled faintly. You'll see, soon enough. You'll see what we've all forgotten. Theo opened his mouth to protest, but something made him stop. The weight of her words hung in the air like a thick fog. Over the next few days, Theo wandered the hospital, exploring every corner, trying to make sense of things. He spoke to patients, to staff, but no one ever looked directly at him. No one ever acknowledged his presence. He started noticing things, small details that didn't make sense. A young boy, Carter, told him he had seen his funeral. I remember, Carter said, his eyes wide and sincere. You were buried in a small graveyard. They said you'd been gone for days. But no one knew you. Theo's chest tightened. The boy's words made his blood run cold. What are you talking about? I'm here. I'm alive. Carter simply nodded. I saw them bury you. They didn't remember you either. Theo walked away, confused, unsettled. But the pieces were starting to fall into place. The hospital didn't just house the lost. It was the lost. The patients weren't just forgotten by the world. They were forgotten by themselves, and so was he. It was all so clear now. The staff didn't look at him because they didn't remember him. He wasn't alive in the world outside. He hadn't been for days, weeks. How long had he been wandering? One night, Theo encountered Orderly Grim, a tall, thin figure who moved through the halls like a shadow. Grim's eyes were dead, flat, and emotionless. He was always nearby, watching, guiding the patients. But it was clear he wasn't there to help them. He was there to keep them docile, to keep them trapped. You shouldn't have come here, Grim said in a voice that sent a chill through Theo. No one remembers you. No one will ever remember you. Theo's breath hitched. How do I leave? How do I get out of here? Grim's lips curled into something like a smile. You don't leave. No one leaves until they are remembered. Theo's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean remembered? How does that work? Grim didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Theo grew desperate. He needed to escape. He couldn't stay here forever, but the hospital had its rules, its dark magic. He realized the only way out was to be remembered, to be seen again by someone from the world beyond. He tried to write, tried to leave something behind, anything that could show he had existed. He scrawled his name, his story, on the walls of the hospital, using whatever he could find: charcoal, ink, even blood, desperate to make someone remember him. I was here. I existed. I'm still here, the words said, scratched into the old walls, but no one came, no one acknowledged the writing. No one saw. One morning, when Theo awoke in his room, one of the many rooms he had visited, empty and cold, he realized there was nothing left to do. He had written everything he could: his name, his story, his plea. but he had become just another forgotten soul, and that was it. His name wouldn't be remembered. He would never leave. He sat down, staring at the blank, sterile walls. The hospital, cold and quiet, continued to hum with life, or the semblance of it. He had become just like the others. Forever. Some say that if you visit that hospital, you can still see his writing on the walls. Some say if you listen closely, you can hear his voice, a whisper, a plea for someone, anyone, to remember him. Story number 8. Logan Wells had always been a man of science. A paramedic by profession, his mind craved logic, proof, and reason. There was no room for ghosts or ghost stories in his world, just numbers, vitals, and treatments. But when the call came in, Logan knew he'd be stepping into something he couldn't explain. It was a standard rescue mission at first. A strange radio signal was emanating from a demolished hospital, St. Catherine's, the place where the city's worst tragedies had been recorded in the past. It had been abandoned for years after a fire tore through it, leaving nothing but rubble and charred memories. But someone had picked up an old emergency signal on an abandoned frequency. It wasn't supposed to be there. Logan arrived at the scene with the rest of his crew, Gina, the communications officer, and Lieutenant Braddock, the leader of the team. They were on edge, trying to make sense of the conflicting reports coming through their radios. The hospital had been leveled, the debris scattered over an entire block. Yet, the signal was still coming from somewhere beneath the wreckage. As they suited up, the air felt different, heavy, like the earth itself was waiting for something. Logan glanced at Gina. Her eyes narrowed as she fiddled with her equipment. She was always good with the technical stuff, decoding the language of signals, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. "Got something," she said, her voice tight. "It's coming from below, deeper into the remains." Braddock, the ever-practical officer, glanced at his team. "We go in. This doesn't sit right, but we're the only ones who can investigate." They descended into the hospital's underground, their flashlights flickering as they moved through what had once been the foundation. The space was dark, oppressive, the walls crumbling. The silence of the place was unsettling, and yet the signal buzzed in the background, faint but unmistakable. At the far end of the ruins, something caught Logan's eye, an operating theater untouched by the destruction around it. It stood like a ghost, pristine and functional, as if time had stood still inside. The air grew colder as they approached, and Logan's heart started to pound. This wasn't just a malfunctioning radio. This was something else entirely. On the table in the middle of the room, a figure lay under a thin sheet. It was a man, young, his features pale, sweat trickling down his forehead. His eyes fluttered open when they entered, and his mouth barely moved, but Logan could hear him clearly, as though the words were directly in his mind. 1992, the man whispered, his voice raspy and strained. Logan exchanged a look with Braddock, the hairs on his neck standing on end. "What's he saying?" The patient's eyes locked onto Logan's. 1992, tsunami, Indonesia, thousands. Logan stepped forward, his medical training kicking in. He checked the man's pulse, feeling a faint thrum against his fingers. "He's alive," he muttered. "But how?" The man's eyes glimmered with a strange awareness, almost as if he had seen something Logan couldn't. "You don't understand. It's already happening." Gina's voice crackled over the radio, cutting through the tension. "Guys, I've been decoding the signal. The numbers, they match dates. Real disasters." "The date?" he just said. "It's a match. A tsunami in Indonesia. 1992. Braddock's jaw tightened. What the hell is this? Some kind of sick joke? But Logan wasn't so sure. The air in the room felt charged, like static electricity, a hum that ran through his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. The patient was connected to the signal somehow, connected to the whispers in the air. The man's voice broke through his thoughts again. 2001, September 11th. Towers fall. Logan's stomach twisted. He's predicting disasters? What the hell? Before anyone could respond, a loud crack echoed through the room. A part of the ceiling collapsed, sending debris falling around them. The ground shook, and Logan's heart nearly stopped. The building was unstable, but it felt like something else was happening. Something bigger. Gina shouted, "The radio signal's changing. It's accelerating." As the team scrambled to find cover, the patient on the table gasped. 2004. Boxing Day. Tsunami. The waves. They'll come again. Logan could barely hear him over the roar in his head. The signal. It was affecting him. He could feel it now. The hum. The static. His thoughts began to blur. "Focus!" Braddock snapped, trying to rally the team. "We need to get out now." But it was too late. The man on the table was still whispering, his voice barely audible over the clatter. "It's all tied together. The signal. The deaths. Your deaths." The room seemed to close in on Logan, the air thickening. He tried to steady his breath, but it felt like there was no air left, like the hospital was sucking it out of him. Panic gripped him. Then came the next number. 2011. Japan. Earthquake. The shaking never stops. Logan's vision blurred, the walls bending. He reached for the radio, desperate for answers. "We need to stop this. Shut the signal down." But as his hand hovered over the device, the world around him began to warp. His mind wasn't just racing, it was being pushed. He could feel the numbers, the dates, pounding in his head. The disasters, they weren't just predictions. They were manifesting in real time. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, harder this time. The building groaned, as if the earth itself was about to tear open. Braddock shouted, "Get to the exit, now!" But Logan couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his body heavy, like gravity had tripled. The man on the table was still whispering. The date was there in his mind, inside his very soul. 2019. Australia. Fires. Millions will burn. Logan's body shook violently. The signal. It was doing something to him. He was becoming part of it. His body was pulling him toward it, against his will. "We need to destroy the radio," Gina shouted, grabbing the equipment. "Now!" Logan finally forced his legs to move, stumbling toward the radio, his hands trembling as he reached for the dial. He ripped the device from its mount and threw it to the ground. The signal. Gone. The world seemed to hold its breath. But just as they thought they were safe, Logan felt a sharp pain in his chest. He gasped for air, but the room still felt suffocating. The weight of the signal pressing down on him, even though it was gone. His skin burned. He looked down at his arm and screamed. Numbers, dates, were written across his skin. They appeared in black, as if someone had scratched them there with jagged nails. 2005, 2011, 2019. He stumbled back, unable to understand. "It's not over. It's not over," he gasped. Braddock was backing away, his eyes wide with terror. What the hell did we just unleash? The man on the table smiled, his voice almost a whisper in Logan's ear. "You're part of it now. You always were. And with that, Logan realized the truth. The disaster wasn't over. It had just begun. The signal, an ancient frequency, hadn't been silenced. It had only changed frequencies. And now, Logan and his team would never escape it. Story number 9. Tanya Ree was nervous, but she had a reason. This was her first shift as a nurse at St. Augustine's Hospital, a place that had seen better days. The hospital was set to be demolished in a month, and the halls were already starting to show their age. The peeling paint, the flickering lights, the smell of something old and forgotten, it all made Tanya feel like she'd stepped into a place stuck in time. But she didn't mind. She needed a fresh start. And this place, as run down as it was, seemed like just the kind of place where she could leave her past behind. The day started off like any other. The patients were quiet, the nurses were busy, and Tanya was just getting the hang of things. But then she saw it. The room at the end of the hall. Room 313. It was a small, inconspicuous door, barely noticed by anyone else. But something about it called to Tanya. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind that door. It was locked, of course. A small faded sign on the door said, "Out of order," but that didn't stop her from staring at it. She made a mental note to ask about it later. It wasn't until the evening shift that things started to feel off. Around midnight, Tanya was walking down the corridor when she heard it. A faint noise, like a soft buzzing, followed by the unmistakable sound of an alarm. Her heart skipped a beat. Was something happening in room 313? She glanced down the hallway. The sound was coming from behind that door. It shouldn't have been possible. That room was supposed to be sealed off. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. But curiosity, as it often does, won out. Tanya walked toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. It was still locked, but the alarm was growing louder. Something was wrong. She knew it. She couldn't explain why, but she had to get in there. Her eyes darted around and she spotted the janitor's closet down the hall. She slipped inside, grabbed the spare set of keys, and returned to room 313. She was breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She unlocked the door. As soon as the door creaked open, the smell hit her. Something musty, old, almost like mildew mixed with something metallic. The lights inside flickered like they were barely hanging on. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. Then she saw it. A mirror, standing against the far wall of the room, its surface cracked, but still reflecting the dim light. The room was empty, except for the mirror. She walked closer, her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. Tanya froze. The reflection was her, but not her. The woman in the mirror had the same features, the same posture, the same eyes. But there was something wrong. Her reflection was smiling. It was a smile that didn't match the fear in Tanya's chest. It was a smile that was all wrong, twisted, somehow. And then the reflection spoke. "Help me," it said. "Please, help me. You have to switch places with me. I can't stay here anymore." Tanya stepped back, her heart pounding in her ears. She was trembling now, the words echoing in her mind. She wanted to run, to get out, but she couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the mirror. The reflection of her, but not her, kept pleading. "I'm stuck," it whispered. "I'm trapped here. Switch with me, and I'll take your place." Tanya's breath caught. She reached out, but the reflection reached back, mimicking her every movement. It was like the mirror had become a doorway to something else. Something wrong. Then the door slammed shut behind her. Tanya spun around. The room was suddenly darker, colder. The alarms in the distance were louder now, as if something had been triggered. She turned back to the mirror, her mind racing, her thoughts tumbling over each other. And that's when she saw it. The door behind the mirror. It was a door that wasn't there before. A door she knew wasn't part of the room. It led into a hallway. And standing in the doorway was herself. The woman in the reflection, but now she was in the room with her. The reflection had stepped out of the mirror. "Why are you doing this?" Tanya whispered, her voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The woman in the mirror smiled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a smile of plea. It was something darker. "I just want to go home," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. "I want to leave this place. I want you to stay." Tanya's blood ran cold. She was in the room with her own reflection, but it wasn't her anymore. It was something else. Something wrong. Then Tanya understood. She wasn't the first to walk into room 313. Every nurse before her had vanished, swallowed by the mirror. Trapped, never remembered, their reflections taking their place. The room was a dimensional gateway, a place where time and reality bent, a trap for anyone unlucky enough to stumble in. And now it was her turn. The woman, no, the thing, reached out, her hands stretching unnaturally long like shadows in the dark. Tanya screamed, but the reflection's hands were already on her, pulling her toward the mirror. "No!" Tanya cried, pushing against the wall, but it was no use. The cold glass was pulling her in, dragging her toward it. In a final act of desperation, Tanya grabbed the nearest object, a metal lamp, and smashed it against the mirror. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, the glass scattering like shards of ice. The room was silent. The mirror was gone, replaced by empty walls. But as Tanya looked at herself in the reflection of the broken glass, she froze. Her face was still the same, but it wasn't. The reflection staring back at her was no longer hers. The eyes were darker, hollowed. The smile was twisted, unnatural. She was no longer looking at herself. She had become the reflection. Tanya screamed, but the sound was muffled. She was trapped, no longer a nurse, no longer a person. She was the reflection, the one waiting for the next victim. And as she screamed in the empty room, she realized something terrifying. The mirror was still there, just not where she could see it. It was inside her now, forever. Story number 10. Nick Caro had never been one to shy away from a challenge. As a popular urban explorer and YouTuber, he was known for venturing into the most dangerous abandoned places. The kind of locations that most people wouldn't dare step foot in. But for Nick, it was all about the thrill. The rush of uncovering hidden histories and showing his followers the forgotten corners of the world. So when he found out about St. Mark's Hospital, an old, decrepit facility rumored to have been shut down for decades, Nick couldn't resist. The building had been condemned after a series of bizarre events in the 1960s, including multiple unexplained deaths, but that only made it more enticing for Nick and his viewers. A hospital left to rot, a place with a history of strange disappearances. That was gold for his channel. Jess, his best friend and the one person who always joined him on these dangerous missions, was less enthusiastic about the place. She didn't share Nick's love of exploring haunted, dilapidated buildings. But she went along anyway. She always did. They arrived at the hospital just before dusk. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked concrete and shattered windows. The building loomed in front of them, a hollow shell of its former self. The doors were locked, as expected, but Nick knew how to get inside. After a bit of maneuvering, they were in. The inside was even worse than they expected. Water-stained ceilings, torn wallpaper, and the smell of mildew and decay clung to the air. Nick pulled out his camera, his voice loud and excited, a contrast to the eerie silence surrounding them. "All right, guys, welcome to St. Mark's Hospital. Let's see what secrets we can uncover tonight." As they explored the building, Nick and Jess found nothing too unusual at first, just the typical wreckage of a hospital long forgotten by time. But then they stumbled across a sealed-off nurses' station hidden behind a door that had clearly been locked for years. Nick's curiosity got the better of him. He pulled at the door, using his tools to pry it open. When the door finally gave way with a creak, they were greeted by a small, dusty room filled with old medical supplies and paperwork scattered on the floor. But one thing caught Nick's eye. A list, handwritten on a piece of yellowing paper. It was an inventory of patients, each with a room number and name. It seemed strange. The names on the list were from decades ago, but there was one entry that stood out. Room 000. Unknown. Nick's heart raced. It was an odd entry. Room 000? What did that mean? Was it a room that had never been used? Or something else? "Hey, Jess, check this out," Nick said, his voice tinged with excitement. He held up the paper for her to see. Room 000. Unknown. Jess frowned, crossing her arms. "That's creepy, Nick. You sure you want to go looking for it?" Nick's eyes gleamed with the thrill of discovery. "Of course I do. This could be the thing that sets this whole exploration apart. It's too good to pass up." Jess hesitated, but didn't argue. "All right, but I'm not sticking around if this gets weird. You know I'm out if it feels off." Nick nodded, fully aware that Jess was already thinking of leaving. She always got skittish when things felt too real. But he wasn't about to stop now. Not when something this strange was right in front of him. They continued their search for room 000, navigating through the hospital's winding corridors. But the deeper they went, the more unsettling things became. The architecture started to look wrong. Sections of the hospital that seemed too narrow, doors that shouldn't have been there, strange staircases that led nowhere. There was a palpable sense of something breathing in the darkness. As they ventured further, something even stranger happened. The list Nick had found earlier, the one with the names and room numbers, seemed to change. The ink on the page shifted, the names rearranging. And then, to his horror, a new name appeared. Nick Caro. Room 000. What the hell? Nick muttered, staring at the paper in disbelief. This wasn't here before. Jess leaned in, her face pale. Nick, this isn't good. This isn't part of the plan. But Nick was already too far in, his mind racing with the possibilities. How could his name appear on a list from decades ago? It didn't make sense. It didn't matter. He had to find room 000. The place felt alive, like it was waiting for him. They finally reached a hallway that shouldn't exist. The walls were crumbling, the floorboards warped and brittle. But at the end of the hallway, there it was. Room 000. The door was old, covered in rust, and sealed shut. The number 000 was carved into the wood, jagged and uneven. Nick's hands shook as he reached for the door. The air in the hallway was thick, like something was pressing down on them. Jess was behind him, her voice barely a whisper. "Nick, I don't think we should..." But it was too late. He pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dark, but there was a faint, pulsing light coming from the far corner. As Nick stepped inside, he was struck by the overwhelming feeling of déjà vu. The room was small, cramped, with walls that seemed to stretch unnaturally high. Old surgical tools were scattered on a workbench covered in dust and rust. There were pieces of furniture that looked like they'd been ripped from a time long past. Hospital beds, old IV poles, and monitors that hadn't worked in years. And then there was a sound, a low, throbbing hum that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Nick," Jess said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. This place is wrong." But Nick didn't hear her. His eyes were locked onto something in the center of the room. A shadowy figure hunched over, sitting on the floor. The figure's head snapped up, and Nick's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, but not quite. His skin was pale and thin, like tissue paper, his eyes hollow. He was staring directly at Nick. "You don't belong here," the man whispered, his voice raspy, almost inaudible. "You never have." Nick's heart pounded in his chest as the man stood up. "You're part of the inventory now, just like the others." Nick took a step back, his mind racing. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of someone who had lost everything. "I'm Mr. Kane, a patient who never left, and neither will you." Suddenly, the walls of the room seemed to close in. The shadows twisted and shifted. The temperature dropped. The light flickered. Nick's body went cold as the hum grew louder, like 1,000 voices calling out to him. "Get out of here, Nick!" Jess screamed, but the door slammed shut, trapping them both inside. The list, Nick's name, flashed in his mind. He had become part of the hospital's inventory, just like everyone else who had come before him. As the darkness closed in, Nick realized the terrible truth. The hospital was rebuilding itself, absorbing explorers like him, drawing them into its depths, to feed its endless hunger. Nick's vision blurred and his breath quickened. He wasn't going to make it out, not alive anyway. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the list, still in his hands, now reading Nick Caro, room 000. Jess made it out of the hospital, terrified and shaken to the core. She ran all the way to the entrance, gasping for air. But when she tried to contact Nick, the phone call went straight to voicemail. There was no answer. She never saw Nick again. The next day, the police arrived to investigate, but there was nothing left to find. The hospital had vanished, completely, as if it had never existed. All that remained was the inventory list, tucked away in the nurse's station, and now a new name appeared on the list. Jess, room 000.